I'm really honored to be up here, and it's great to see a lot of friendly faces. We're here to talk about the 25th anniversary of charters and the 20th anniversary of DC charters. And I'm sitting here with some amazing guests. First, before I start, may I just ask, is everyone familiar with what a charter school is? We're laughing, but like show of hands. Kind of, maybe. Are folks generally familiar with the DC ecosystem? Pretty robust, right? Okay. Well, our job up here today is to give sort of a historical perspective of where DC's been, the role of philanthropy in the midst of that, and just sort of how we've grown and evolved in the midst of that process. To provide a little bit more context, I'm going to give a history of the legislation that led us to the opportunities that we have today. Checker's going to give us a context of where charters have been and where they might be going. And then after that, we'll have an amazing conversation with our esteemed colleagues here. And so with that, I'm going to start us off with a quick history of DC charters, how our law came to be, and then I'll introduce our panel. So first of all, what's really interesting is where we are today in the District of Columbia with public school choice as well as private school choice goes back to the late 1980s. At the time in 1988, we had the Committee on Public Education, also known as COPE, was established by the federal city to kind of evaluate the state of education in the city. They came to the conclusion that the schools were truly broken, that the bureaucracy was heavy. Schools often didn't have basic functioning needs, that the environment was dilapidated. The bureaucracy was totally unnecessary, and kids were obviously not performing. As early as, and they kind of came back, one little note of the report said, most PTAs spent most of their energy ensuring schools had the basics like books, cleaning supplies, and actual teaching staff, which is really, really sad. So recommendations included rethinking approaches to curriculum, program structure, staff development, facilities, overhauling the central management, raising standards to ensure that you had a high-quality workforce, that you had 80% graduation rates, and that students at a minimum were a 50 percentile on standardized tests. I think today, if we look back, we've made a lot of progress in the last almost 30 years, but we still have a ways to go. COPE raised a bunch of money and said, we're going to try to make this happen. It didn't happen, unfortunately. Even by the mid-1990s, you had a Washington Post article that said, regarding some high-profile controversies, schools couldn't open on time because many of them had hundreds of fire code violations. A federal audit found that money meant for building repairs had been diverted to pay people in the system's bloated bureaucracy. And then it came to light that most of the board members had already, the highest in the country, went ahead and gave themselves pay raises even though they had publicly voted against that for themselves. We had in the mid-90s, Focus was launched. It was for previously known as Education First Coalition by Mike Peabody. And they began a concerted effort to raise awareness about other options. As many of you guys know, with 21st anniversary of charters, the first charter law was passed in 1991. This movement was being brought to Washington, D.C. We saw the Cleveland Park Citizens Association passed a resolution for its community to do essentially a 3-sector approach, everything from charters to public school choice to opportunity scholarships. And at the same time as the city itself, under I believe Marion Barry, was suffering from an over $700 million budget shortfall. All of this gained the attention of Congress, and they took it upon themselves to begin the effort to give the city additional efforts to change the direction. So in 1995, we had the School Reform Act. It's still kind of looked upon, obviously some amendments have been passed since, but is looked upon as being one of the better charter laws in the country. And obviously, I'm not touching on all the politics, but specifically, the first charter school opened in the fall of 1996, so this is its 20th year. It was initially authorized by the Board of Education. Congress later stepped in and said no longer can the Board of Education, everything was going to be authorized just by the DC Public Charter School Board. Today, 44% of district students attend public charter schools. There are 118 individual charters operated by more than 65 nonprofits. And it's really, overall, it's really a remarkable story. So now that I've laid that framework, I'm excited to introduce our panelists. The first, on my farthest right, is Checker Finn. He is a writer, he's a thinker, he's been engaged in the charter authorizing space, and of late, he's the former president of the Fordham Institute and is lately the new author of the book that we were going to kind of touch on today, the state of the charter schools at a crossroads, predicaments, paradoxes, and possibilities. Next is Scott Pearson, is someone that I've gotten to know in my former life. He is the head of the DC Public Charter School Board. He had a tour at the Department of Education under the Obama administration and innovation. He's been a charter leader and has also had an extensive background in business. We're joined by Catherine Bradley, who has been an incredible leader here in the District of Columbia, both in helping the city to rethink what its view of education, both traditional public schools, but also charters. She's been able to bring in a lot of amazing charter management organizations, as well as really infuse in talent. It's really fantastic. And I'm joined by Russ Williams, who is the head of the Center City Consortium, which is a group of charter schools here in the city. He also has had extensive background with Appletree, which has an amazing pre-K early learning program, or early learning charter school. So with that, I'm thrilled to be here. Just for timeline, hopefully at 4:15 we'll begin Q&A, so get ready of all of your questions. And Checker, please kick us off.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, everybody. Thanks to my colleagues at Hoover for letting us be here. A couple of my Hoover friends and colleagues are here. One of my co-authors is here, Brandon Wright, in the back of the room. Raise your hand, Brandon. The third author, Bruno Manno, is in Italy, probably glad to be escaping American politics for the next couple of weeks. And I really appreciate everybody on the panel sort of shoving their calendars and schedules out of whack in order to join us here this afternoon. And appreciate all of you coming on a beautiful sunny afternoon. Brandon and Bruno and I did indeed set out to deal with the 25th anniversary of charter schools nationally in this book, and you got copies of it. I hope you'll have a look at it. It's the only criticism of it so far from a forthcoming review is that it's too balanced. So read it and see if you agree with that. But it was meant to be a kind of warts and all look at the good, the bad, the ugly, the present, the past, the future. It will take you through the origins, the growth, the achievement, and other accomplishments and lack of accomplishments, current issues facing the charter movement nationally and what we think might be done about them, everything from governance to authorizing to finance to regulatory creep and things like that. And then a look at the future, which we actually think doesn't have to necessarily be a linear extension of the present. So we'd welcome you having a look. I go to an office in downtown DC, and there is a profile of DC charters in Chapter 12 in the book. So have a look at that, you DC Wallas. There's also Denver and New Orleans in there, because all three are very interesting examples of what chartering has done within a larger K-12 public education context. It's a governance innovation as well as an educational innovation, and I think it's really worth thinking about that way, and these are all three examples of it. Let me show you just a few things nationally, and then we'll get to the DC folks that know the local scene infinitely better than I do. What you're looking at right now are the states with charter laws. As you'll see, almost all of them now have them, at least on the books. This is the enrollment growth of charters over a 23-year period from 1991 to the present. As I think Catherine said, we're pushing 3 million kids in close to 7,000 schools at the present time. This is animated. Watch this. But year by year, these are where the schools turned up. And we thank the Walton Family Foundation for sharing this slide. Market share by city. You'll see DC over near the right with the percent of public school students in charter schools. You'll obviously see New Orleans and Detroit there. You'll see the national average over to the left. What this is are major cities. So there are a lot of smaller places with larger market shares than show here. Dayton, Ohio, for example, has 30+% of the kids in Dayton in charter schools, but it's not here because these are just the big cities with charters. And how many kids in them, how many kids in those cities are enrolled in charters. It's pretty impressive in a bunch of places, and it's been growing big time. Mostly urban, keep that in mind. And then last slide, which I'm going to leave up here, so read it at your leisure. Many of these things you know. I already mentioned the first bullet, except to add that about 400 new charter schools opened last year, and about 272 closed. Important to know. This is a dynamic, growing but dynamic. 250,000 more kids this year. I mentioned that mostly urban, 56% urban. However, 10% are rural, 7% are in small-ish towns. 68% are independent. I don't know what it is in DC now. Independent meaning one-off, sometimes called mom and pop or one-off. The tendency is to recognize the famous and in occasional cases infamous CMOs and EMOs and think that chartering consists only of them. The fact of the matter is that 2/3 of charters still today are one-off or independent charter schools.
Checker, can you quickly say what a CMO is and
Sure.
an EMO is in case someone doesn't
Charter
know?
management, CMO, Charter Management Organization, nonprofit network of charter schools. Achievement First, KIP, a number of local examples. EMO, Education Management Organization, same idea, only for-profit. Let's see. In National Heritage Academies, good for you. Good example. In Ohio, it was White Hat for a long time. They got sold recently to another company. You can go on, but those are the for-profit firms that operate networks of charter schools and are in some ways analogous to the CMOs, but they're all multi-school networks with a kind of central headquarters. Many of them are multi-state, which is important to note. And multi-city. They're not concentrated in just one place. 65% minority in charter schools versus about 50% of non-charter school students in America, and 57% low income. A little more than the national public school average low income. So I'm going to leave those up there. This orients us a little bit to the national scene. As I mentioned, we've got a DC profile with some of that history that Catherine was recounting in the book, and some talk about the DC Charter Board, which Scott leads, and some praise for it as an exemplary authorizer, of which the country doesn't have enough. In some places, it doesn't have enough authorizers. In a few places, like Ohio, it has too many authorizers. DC, it's only got one, but it seems to be working pretty well. So take it away, Catherine.
I'd love to piggyback on what you just sort of led into. We're going to look to Scott. You not only oversee the DC Public Charter School Board, you also chair sort of the National Association of Charter Authorizers. I didn't say the name totally right, but same, but different. Can you walk us through what the authorization process is in general, and maybe more specifically, what makes DC's charter authorizing process unique?
Well, let me start by saying that having Checker say that something works pretty well is very high praise coming from him. So I take that as the highest possible compliment. Authorizers, and Checker points this out in his book, which is extremely informative, and I highly recommend that people read it. He points out that when charters were originally conceived of and the early laws passed, people didn't pay much attention to the authorizing function. I think there was a lot of belief that the market would take care of itself, that if a school was poorly performing or was bad, people wouldn't send their children to that school, and therefore the school would not have any revenues and would close on its own. And one of the many things I think that we've all learned over 25 years of chartering is that authorizing matters a lot. It's sad, but families will continue to send their children to very low performing schools, and unless there's a strong oversight function, the charter sector will contain lots of great schools and also lots of very poor schools, and that's what we see in a lot of states. Basically, an authorizer has three functions. It decides which new applicants and eager groups of people get to open a charter school and therefore receive state money to operate that school. They oversee the school to make sure that it's complying with laws, that it's safe, and that it's stewarding taxpayer money well. And then they have some sort of an oversight process that if a school is not performing well, either does not renew the charter or revokes the charter so that those schools go out of business. That's the basic function. And what we believe very strongly is that when the authorizing function is strong and capable, that charter schools and the charter idea can realize its potential. That you can have lots of choice, you can have lots of quality schools, and you can have a thriving, healthy charter school ecosystem that serves families well. But that when the authorizing function is poor, you have lots of bad schools, and you have the kinds of headline-grabbing mismanagement that sort of casts a shadow over everything that all the good charter schools are doing.
What sort of levers do you have in order to go after, or I should say, rephrase, close underperforming schools? Because obviously, so everyone, I hope, knows that the beauty about a charter school is you articulate your goals and what you intend to achieve, and the hope and theory is that if you don't meet those, is that after a period of time you have to close. So based on what's outlined in the individual charter, but also under your authority, how are you able to either, one, help underperforming charters reach their potential, or say, I'm so sorry, it's time for you to let another school open its place?
Well, our law is very clear. A charter school sets out its goals, and every 5 years we evaluate the school and we determine whether or not they're meeting those goals. And if they have not met those goals, depending on when the charter is in its life cycle, we either may or must close the school. Checker said that he'd heard from one person reviewing the book that his book was balanced. I thought it was balanced, but I also thought it was nuanced. Another thing I think that we've sort of learned over 25 years of charter schools is that the absolutes that people came into this with really don't hold. There are real tensions, and those tensions don't resolve themselves all the way one way or all the way another. And I think the role of authorizing is an example of that. And Checker, one of the real advantages is that he not only led a think tank and worked with two other researchers who've thought about this deeply, but actually served as an authorizer in Ohio, and so lived these kinds of tensions. And one of the real tensions is how much oversight, how much regulation, because what you see is if you have none at all, you have lots of variety of quality, but you also have lots of potential mismanagement. But if you come in too heavy-handed and over-regulate and say, you have to report everything to us every week and we're going to control every aspect of the school.
And you're just a school district.
Then you're just a school district, and
Right.
you squelch the individuality of the schools, and you produce schools where they're spending a disproportionate amount of their time and energy complying with their overseer as opposed to putting that energy into kids. So we try to strike that balance, but every day it is a balancing act, and it's hard. You asked about what do we do to help schools get better, and that's a tricky one for an authorizer. It's pointed out in the book, that if you come in and the school's not doing well, and you say, well, why don't you try this or why don't you try that? You are risking becoming a school district that is guiding people to all be a certain type of school. And you run the risk that if the school does the things you suggest and then continues to fail, you can't really close them because now it's on you. They've been doing what you suggested. And so we struggle with that. We try to provide schools with lots of data. We try to connect them with outside resources so that they can help themselves. And we try to be super clear with them early on, and particularly their boards, about when they're off track. Governance is a critical issue. It's talked about a lot in the book, but what we see is, and actually the Fordham Institute just had a study that showed that higher performing schools tend to have boards who are more engaged and more aware about what's going on at the school. And we view part of our role as an authorizer is making sure that the school's governing boards have the information they need to do their job well. They're not just relying on the executive director telling them that everything at the school is going great, but they're getting real data from the authorizer, impartial, unbiased data, so that they can do their governance job properly.
One more wrinkle to add. In a lot of places, though not DC, the authorizer's revenue comes from a kind of a tax on the schools that they authorize. So to close a school is to diminish your own revenue stream as an authorizer.
That is the case in DC as well.
Is that how you get paid?
It is. We get 1%,
Okay.
It's 118.
but we have 118 schools, so the impact of one closure is less. And there's no good way to fund an authorizer, because if the authorizer gets their money from the state, they're typically underfunded, and then they can be subject to influence by the state about how they do their work. If they get their money from the schools, you run into this risk, particularly for small or subscale authorizers. So we haven't yet found the perfect way to fund an authorizer.
Can I
Catherine?
add one quick comment, just to call attention to how lucky we are in DC to have you and this set of laws around our public charter school board. I think the number is 1/3 of all schools that have ever been opened here have been closed because of academic underperformance or financial mismanagement, which I think is much larger than happens anywhere else. And there's just been an activist stance here that you've taken it as your job to curate this portfolio of schools to make sure that the schools in the charter sector are good. So you have not been shy about moving when schools are not serving kids, and it's helped our city tremendously. So thank you.
I just want to pivot just a little bit to Russ. So Russ oversees the Center City Charter Schools. He's also led the Apple Tree Public Charter Schools, so he has experience in this space from both the early little kids and also older kids. Can you talk to us a little bit of the per pupil allocation, and because obviously we're going to shift to philanthropy and the role of philanthropy. One, how does one run their school? DC has a pretty unique situation in that they have even per pupil allocation, funding allocations, but there's also facility issues, there's startup costs that come with running a charter. How do you run your charter, and is it logical to think that one can even run a charter school on the per pupil allocation?
Yeah, no, I think in DC in particular, we're blessed because there's sufficient funding to run a charter school here. And one of the things, the biggest challenge a lot of schools in DC have are the facility challenges. But we're also fortunate in that DC has a separate facilities funding allocation that, like, if you are thoughtful and you utilize that specifically for your facilities and you take the operating per pupil or per capitation that you receive to run your school, you kind of you keep those two things separate and you're thoughtful about that. The per pupil money that you're given to operate a school tends to be enough to do, a general core academic program. I think, a lot of what you see schools looking to raise funds for, particularly in this market, might be something like real estate, where they go after more expensive or something that the facilities capitation doesn't support, but they know that that building really supports their program or their needs. So you'll be more aggressive, perhaps, and look for some philanthropic funding to bridge or do the gap financing in terms of leveraging the facilities money you get to get a loan. But I think in terms of the overall, the per pupil capitation and what you get to educate students, I think generally schools, like, you have enough money here to run a high quality or a good program. There are things I think that as you build a budget, they're sort of the first things you leave out. And some of those are sometimes things that you would really like to do. Like maybe being, one of the things we've set up, like as a sector, because you have lots of smaller LEAs, something like developing leaders becomes decentralized, right? So where you've got a bunch of people that have to develop people now. And if everyone's running their own programs, there's a lack of scale or economics, and that doesn't make economic sense, right? For a small school to set up its own leadership development program. So how do we come together, bring things together, where we can leverage some of the other? Because one of the things, and I know Georgetown is expanding its program to charters, a leadership program that they had done with DCPS for a few years, but that kind of development is expensive, right? And I think even Walton is stepping in and helping with that program, but there's still a cost to the student and or the school. And as a school, you want people to go through those programs, but they might not be in a position if they're working, and they have a family to fund. Like, how do they pay for that? So it's finding the right balance. Things like that, things like student experiences, things like the arts, like all the different types of enrichments that sometimes get short shrift when you're really focused on putting in a high quality academic program and all of the things that entails in terms of differentiation, meeting kids where they are, making sure that we're doing all the work in terms of leveling sort of the instruction. We have the kids all along the spectrum in terms of achievement and accomplishment. So, but in terms of DC, speaking in this context, we certainly, I believe that we receive enough money on a per pupil basis.
Can you put a
to
number
run
on
a high
that?
quality program.
What is it now?
Well, it varies. Like at the base, like at pre-K 3 and pre-K 4, it's $12,500, right? But at the elementary level, it's like $9,800 per kid. So I think that if you aggregate and average it, I think it's around $11,100, $11,200 per
Okay.
kid, something like that.
Oh.
And then on facilities, you get an additional $3,000, and then you throw your entitlement money and other types of grants that you might receive on top of that, right? And so you can smooth it
At-risk
out.
funding.
Right.
Yeah,
Risk
yeah,
funding,
at-risk
special
funding.
ed funding, ELL funding. When we look at our typical charter school and divide their total budget divided by the total number of students, it ends up being about $18,000
Whoa.
per year
Wow.
per student.
That's twice what many states have.
It's very
At
high.
least, yeah.
I like to say that it gives schools enough money to do anything they want, but it doesn't give them enough money to do everything that they want. So they still have to make choices and make tough choices, like Russ talked about, maybe cutting art program because they're focusing on something else. But it's very generous.
Yeah, Emily Lawson, who's the DC Prep founder, went herself to a very expensive private school here in the city. I think tuition is something like $30,000. And she has said to me, I could do so much if I had the same funding that private school had per child, but I can provide a superb education at, I think she would use 15 to 18 as being the range that they have per child. I can do everything that actually needs to get done. That's not to say they wouldn't love to have more. Right.
Exactly. Just, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind taking us, the City Bridge initially had a broader focus and eventually focused its attention on education, specifically here in DC. As it began its philanthropic efforts, when you looked at the district and you thought about charter schools, what attracted you to charter schools? And how did you see the resources that you had, as well as others within the Washington, D.C. area and maybe even national funders, can make an impact for kids here?
Sure. That's a long historical question. So we
Just maybe even the last 5 years.
We made the pivot to education very intentionally. City Bridge was originally about international health programs that had built out of a company that my husband and I had that did healthcare work. And I began to think it just made no sense to be going around the world looking to invest in projects that helped kids and families when there was a lot to do here. And we began a very intentional, almost 2-year study of what the most leveraged places would be to invest here, and ended up deciding it was education. And then after that, decided to start with early education. How did I get involved with charter schools? It's not a very intentional story. I will say that one day my phone rang and Raj Vinakota of the Seed School, he and Eric Adler had founded the Seed School, said, can I come and tell you about the project that I'm launching? And I said, sure. And Raj is brilliant and charismatic, and they had this wonderful idea to start an urban public boarding school. I ended up investing in the early days of that school and actually being on their board for a little while. I met Emily Lawson the same way. She called and said, I really want to take you to lunch and tell you what I'm doing. I said, sure. We went to the Tabard Inn. She told me her story about tutoring a young man her own age across the city and realizing that he was so smart that he was able to hide the fact from her that he could not read across multiple tutoring sessions. And what she realized in that moment was that he had greater intelligence and native ability than most people she was working with at her school, but that he couldn't read, so he was not going to have the same opportunities she had. And I think that just changed her view of what she wanted to do with her life. So I invested in DC Prep too. And then years later, when City Bridge decided that we would invest in early education, those were just two relationships I had. So they were two of the first schools we approached to say, are you interested in working with us to do early childhood work in the district, which was the same time the law was being passed to allow really funding for 3- and 4-year-olds. DC Prep said yes. Seed School said no, that's off mission for us, which I completely respect. And so that meant that DC Prep was one of the first schools we worked with in our early childhood portfolio, which is now like 2004, 2005.
It's amazing. As you've considered your investment in DC, and I'm going to ask a little bit of this of Russ as well, is when you're getting ready to make an investment, is it typically for a one-time situation? Or is it something that you hope is part of general operating costs? It might be in the early stages, it might be longer term. Like, how do you think through what type of investment you might make in a particular charter school?
So we're a little different. We are more like venture philanthropy than like traditional philanthropy. There are wonderful organizations in this city that make it their business to fund the great operating work that's happening. We tend to fund based on trying to solve a particular problem. So for instance, in the early childhood portfolio, we were looking for partners who wanted to build out programs for early childhood and looking for teacher training programs that wanted to work in the early childhood area. And so we would tend to go to different places and say, here's a body of work. Are you interested in working with us on this? And as with the Seed School example, we don't want anyone to ever say yes if it's not on mission for them. So for us, we're usually getting things started or trying to bring different groups together to solve big problems. We are not traditionally year after year operational funders. That's not to say that that's not needed in the market, and there are wonderful nonprofits here that actually fill that role.
So you sort of, I was going to ask Russ this question, you kind of already touched on it, Catherine, about how you were excited about early learning, and you asked Seed if they were interested in investing, and they're like, that's not part of our mission. Russ, for those charter schools that are out seeking resources and they have an opportunity to potentially receive a grant from a very generous donor, at what point do they say, gosh, this is not totally aligned with our mission, and they walk away from the resources? Or because oftentimes with these grants it comes some sort of reporting requirement, or at what point do they say, yes, that's going to require a lot of work for us in order to effectively use those dollars, but we will gladly do it because it will help us achieve fill in the blank?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the school, right, and/or the school leader, and I agree with Catherine. Like, there are opportunities where someone might talk to you, and then you have to look at it and say that doesn't really fit with the work we're doing, or with our mission, or with the direction we're heading, and so you're better off steering yourself away from that than like trying to, like, Seed is better off focusing on what they did than taking the money and trying to make some kind of early ed play work, right? So I think you have to be smart, and it all depends on where you are in your organizational life cycle, the stages you're in, and like of your development, your maturity. So like that, to me, like, it's a function of kind of where you are and what makes sense for you at the time. I think if you're in a pretty stable place and you're looking at it thoughtfully, you'll know to walk away if it doesn't fit. But if you're in an earlier nascent stage, you might take that leap of faith and hope that you can figure out a way to utilize the money and improve your program or build your program. I mean, I think part of what Catherine was talking about in terms of how I think part of what the work that you all do now is like you catalyze, right? And when people get money from you all, I think when people get money from you all, I think your group City Bridge is very good about saying, here's how we're going to catalyze things, but know that we want to understand your plan to taper off of us and or support this going forward. So, and when folks are really clear about that on the front end, that's also very helpful, right? Because if you're looking at that as a way to like launch something, you have to be mindful of what's our 3 to 5 year window in terms of using this money to get that going, and then also to build it into our operating budget so that we're not reliant or dependent upon outside funds to sustain that work. So, and then there's value to that, like in terms of like innovating or trying something or piloting something, and if it really goes well or if it really sticks, then you figure out how do you leverage those funds to kind of make it an ongoing concern within your organization. Yeah.
I wanted to touch something that Checker referenced. It was also included in a book edited by Rick Hess at American Enterprise Institute. It was based on research that Sarah Reckow had done. There's a quote from one of these books, I think it was maybe both. Foundations can be critical in determining which ideas or initiatives move ahead and which organizations are high quality and worthy of private and public investment and which stall. This is sort of a general question to everybody. Folks are familiar, at least in the District of Columbia, with the names like KIPP and Achievement First and Center City and Apple Tree and DC Prep, and there's some various names that are out there, rocket ships in the city. Is there ever concern that because these high-profile names with the backing of both local and national philanthropy, that it crowds out the space for new innovative models?
In the book, we ding philanthropy a bit for this, for two things. One is only wanting to replicate success rather than take a flyer on innovation. And the other is overinvest in the so-called no excuses variety of charter schools focused entirely on a kind of intensive education for poor inner city kids, and doing that well in many cases, but to the neglect of other populations that might benefit from charter schools and from chartering. So we do get critical in the book on this point of nationally. That's not a DC reference.
Well, I think we're sitting next to somebody who's the exact antidote to that. I mean, Catherine's and the City Bridges have made major investment in innovation through funding individual educators as well as funding schools. And so it may be that nationally there's not enough money going into that, but in DC, thanks very largely to City Bridge, we're seeing a huge focus on innovation in this space, not just in charter schools, but also in DCPS.
I think, thank you for that, by the way, Scott. I think that there are many philanthropists who really want to make sure that their money gets spent well and that there are outcomes that attach to their grants. And if that's your frame, you're going to send your money to KIPP and Rocket Ship and DC Prep, places that have a fantastic track record where it's as sure thing as you're going to get in this field. I'm going to give the grant, and X number of children are going to have a dramatically different education as a result. And I don't fault that, and we need people to do that. My concern, if that's the only kind of thinking out there, is that let me back up. I have a national concern with philanthropy in the country, and that is that as we become more focused on outcomes, some philanthropists have been framing their grants almost like buying outcomes. And if you do that in our sector, everyone's going to crowd into the last 2 minutes of the work right before the new seat is created. And in fact, there's a big pipeline of stuff that needs to happen before that seat gets created. There's investments in teachers and leaders. There's the whole ecosystem in this city that is so vibrant and healthy here that really helps us. There's parent engagement work to make sure that there's real demand for an authentic demand for the school seats that we're creating. And if we're not investing in all of those things which don't have the direct link to the seat that's being created, we're not going to have those seats at the end. But if all we want is to own the outcome of the seat,
Right.
we're going to fail to invest in everything else.
Then you pay for the 127th KIPP school.
Which wouldn't be a bad thing.
No, it's
but-
not a bad thing.
not a
And
bad
you're
thing.
reasonably confident the money will be well spent and the kids will benefit. But it doesn't do those other things.
Yeah, and
But I was going to say, in addition to City Bridge, which Scott is correct, there are other opportunities here in DC for all schools, and one of the other great levelers is the Walton Foundation, because anyone who is starting a school has the opportunity to go to them and seek startup funding. So they're not necessarily selective. I mean, they have a rigorous selection process once you express an interest, and they want to know that you have like a good plan, and ideally, like it looks like you will succeed. But everyone who receives a charter from the authorizer has an opportunity to go before them and to like make a request for some money to support their startup. So like it's sort of six of one, half does the other, right? Like some foundations focus one way and some focus another, and I think it's just being aware of the landscape and where and when you need to approach which foundation would make the most sense. I mean, had Jack and I known that Raj and Emily back 10 years ago, you just had to place a call to Catherine and do lunch, we probably would have done the same thing. You know, like it's just a function of knowing what you're supposed to do at the time.
But the Walton point deserves, I'm a huge Walton fan, but they've also done their pre-selection in the sense that DC is important to them. They don't have an equal commitment to Cincinnati right now.
True.
Perhaps they will one day. But right now, you are much likelier to get Walton startup money if you're in DC than if you're in Cincinnati. That's all.
But Checker, you wouldn't want them to spread their money equally around the country, would you?
But they have pre-selected places that they
Right.
think deserve investment, which is a cousin of pre-selecting KIPP to put another KIPP school in.
But I think pre-selecting is not the right term, because Walton has been very thoughtful about where, like the quote-unquote markets that they want to invest their money based upon like data and research and some analysis. I don't think they looked at the map and said, you know, we have family in DC, let's invest there. I think they picked 12 or 15 markets based upon what the data and what other information told them was sort of the need and where they might have the most leverage.
Well, and
for their
where's
investment.
there been success already, which might be what didn't lead them to Cincinnati.
But we should also spare a thought for the poor philanthropist who's looking at, you know, an education market where the state spends almost $700 billion a year on public education. And so even the most generous, well-funded philanthropist recognizes that their money is a drop in an ocean. And so if they want to have impact, they have to focus. And if you focus, you're going to need to make choices on what your theory of change is and what you prioritize and what you think is going to make a difference.
I don't disagree. I think the Empathy for Philanthropists Club could meet in a phone booth.
But you're going to be in it, right?
Oh, boy.
I think going back to that point, and maybe Catherine and others can chime in, what sort of mindset does a philanthropist need to have and to go into that venture stage to say, I'm willing to invest in the ecosystem, I'm willing to invest in the talent, because we can have really great schools, but if we don't have teachers and leaders that can fill those roles and create a dynamic learning environment both for the charter and or the traditional public sector, well, unfortunately, this is going to wither on the vine. So what sort of mindset does a philanthropist even need to have in order to make those startup investments?
Well, I think to invest in, first of all, we have been, I'm a big KIPP partisan. I'm on the national board. My husband's on the local board. I want KIPP to be as large and as successful as it possibly can be here. Where I'm spending my time right now and my energy and where City Bridge is spending its time is on this pipeline of new school creation. We're comfortable doing that because we're comfortable with the risk involved. And not every philanthropy is going to be comfortable making risky bets. I think our view is it's exactly where philanthropy and the private sector should be investing, that it's once something is proven that it should move into public sources of funding and be scaled, and that it's actually best to use private dollars for some of the newer things. I think if everything we did succeeded, I'd be operating in way too safe of a way. And I'll just give you one example, because City Bridge does invest in charter and traditional public school sectors. So when Michelle arrived, she wanted to create a portfolio of schools called the Catalyst schools. And it was, people don't even remember it anymore, but it was one of her signature early programs. 13 schools, traditional public schools, would have specialty programs in STEM, in the arts, and in foreign languages. was one of the big things she was raising money for in addition to the teacher's contract. And that was the first large DCPS grant that City Bridge did. And we were doing work and research to help her as well. So a couple years later, after a lot of work and a lot of money, DCPS leadership decided that it just wasn't the priority anymore. And that's their prerogative to do that. They're the ones balancing what's their priority, where are they going to put their resources, what should they move forward, what should they put on the shelf. We as the philanthropist investing in it have to be okay for that. We have to be okay trusting the leaders with whom we've invested to make those decisions and not fight for something just because we've put money into it. So those programs did good work. They don't really exist anymore. We have to be fine for that. And I think that's a little bit of a risk-taking mentality that not every philanthropy shares. Maybe we're comfortable with it because we came out of operating businesses where you have to operate that way.
Well, even just a little bit of a mentality of humility, and maybe not just the accolades that come sometimes with philanthropy, your name on a building. And sometimes that can be hard, sort of balancing, like I've been generous and I want this to succeed, and then therefore I want it to continue because I contributed to that cause. So humility, I think, probably, as you're talking about that venture mentality or venture philanthropy mentality, is that you have to be willing to say it's a great idea, but it might not continue.
I mean, you're nice to say that, but I think it's also just simply knowing the right role, knowing what my lane is, and knowing what Kaya Henderson's lane is or what Scott Pearson's lane is. It's not my lane to decide whether Catalyst schools are still the priority or not. I can decide whether to help them do it once it is a priority for them. But then if they decide that other things are more important, I have to be totally fine with that. I have to be able to trust the people who are actually making the decisions and are closest to the data themselves to make the right decision.
Which also means you have to be able to say at some point that some money you spent was not productive.
Right. You have to be okay with some failure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and a lot of funders really are very nervous, very skittish about failure. You get occasional glimpses of even large philanthropies admitting that something they did didn't work very well. Gates has done that a couple times, to their credit. Said we, $18 million into this initiative, and well, not very much to show for it.
They got slammed for it.
They got slammed.
Kind of unfairly. But.
Annenberg, I don't think ever admitted that they made a mistake, but everybody that ever looked at the $500 million spent by the Annenberg Foundation concluded that it produced no lasting change anywhere.
Just to retract a little bit, there was a little bit of jab at philanthropy that you all referenced in the book Checker about a number of donors, both local and national, contribute to about 8 or so, maybe close to 10 charter schools in the district. I don't know how.
We quoted a Washington Post article saying that philanthropy in the charter sector in the district was heavily concentrated and that produced winners and losers. I'm paraphrasing.
So, Scott, when you hear something like that, and your job is to authorize great schools, close those that are underperforming, how do you take a quote like that sort of this proxy of these are good schools and therefore individuals are only investing in those? How do you look at that generally within the DC charter sector? Might need to rephrase my question.
Well, I hear that complaint a lot from school leaders. There's a perception in DC. So there's 65 charter organizations operating 118 schools. And there is a perception that there are those that are favored and there are those that are not favored. And there's some correlation between the school's performance, whether it's measured by our accountability framework where we call schools Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. But there's also some schools that just have more social capital or they're better known. And there are schools that perform very highly that get almost no philanthropy and they're frustrated about it because they have the same needs that everyone else does. I guess what I would say, it's somewhat leavened in DC by, and really across the country. So we talk about philanthropy, but in fact the largest source of grants to charter schools is the federal government. The federal charter schools program currently gives out about $300 million a year to launch new schools. And those are all across the country, not every state. States have to compete for which ones get it. And that dwarfs any contribution toward charter schools, even from the Gates Foundation or the Walton Family Foundation. And in DC, we have a state-funded grant program for charter schools called the SOAR Act, which gives out about $15 million a year. Again, probably as large as any philanthropy in the city. So I think that helps leaven it, but nevertheless, it is true. There are haves and have-nots, and it's not only correlated with quality.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if you're running a good school, like someone might help make an introduction to it. Like you might have that connection or the introduction. But I think, in my school, right, the school I currently run, which I've been at now for a little over 3 years, is a really good example of, when I first got there, we were very much in a turnaround situation. And like part of the conversation at the board level, and I see my board chair in the back, I say, hi Tom, was, should we be, we've had these conversations as a board, like should we be raising money? And part of my retort to the board and one of the board members who was very interested in doing development is we're not ready. Like we don't have a story right now. We've got to fix things. We need time to get the school on the right path, and then we need to figure out what it is, what is our trajectory, what is our story, before we go approach like anyone in terms of philanthropic dollars. Now, we were also fortunate in that we had some board members with capacity, and this is sort of like the amplifying power of philanthropy, right? We had a board member when I got there. He goes, what's an early win? And I said, give me a few days to go talk to the staff and figure out what we need. So like before the end of my first week, I called them and I said, and I went out and talked to all 6 campuses, talked to all the staff. And this is 2013, and our teachers had not been issued computers. So I called him and I said, I need $200,000 to buy all of my staff computers. And we went through the math and he goes, okay, I'll get back to you. 10 minutes later, he calls me back and he goes, you got it.
Wow.
A week later, a $200,000 check showed up, gave it right to finance, told the IT director, buy everyone laptops. And when we went to the next PD, once we knew what we had the money, and we were buying everybody, we decided we were buying a max, so we spent a little bit more per person than maybe we needed to. But we knew that was much more valuable, like to the teachers. When we told the staff that we were getting the max that summer, because this was in the spring that he did it, I'm not kidding you. There's 200 adults jumping up out of their seats, like ecstatic. It's like hallelujah, we're getting computers. We're quote unquote a 21st century school. So that was a very catalyzing moment. It was an early win. It helped us sort of reset the trajectory of the school and help reset the culture and the climate of the school. It was one of many steps that allowed us to do that. But that was very much like a catalytic moment for the school that like an individual philanthropist provided the opportunity for us to do that. It was a very powerful moment in terms of the school shifting from and beginning that turnaround effort. And so that's a good example of where the philanthropy.
It's also, if I can say, the easiest no-brainer version of philanthropy, because you get immediate gratitude for an absolutely indisputably positive thing. It's not very risky.
Not very risky.
Can you tell us how he got how he found it in 10 minutes?
Yes. I think said individual donor had previously been in real estate and had sold off his portfolio and is very much in the phase of just has his own family foundation and makes but his quote unquote board I think is himself. He makes the investment decisions as.
Let me check with the board.
So yeah. I think that's kind of what it is.
He's like, am I okay with buying
myself.
200 computers?
So yeah.
But that's really interesting. You just said about Center City and your board, well, should we go out and fundraise? Well, probably some of the changes that you needed to make required some financing, I'm assuming, but yet you didn't feel comfortable to go on a big fundraising streak because you didn't feel like you had a story to tell. So what's the balance?
So the work was to look at everything we were doing and figure out, are we making the right investments, with the money that we're receiving from the city, right? That's the first thing. And one of the things I also remember, in terms of is how many outside contractors or third parties that we had working in the school. And so, that's less than half of when I got there. What we have now is less than half of what was there. And those are all things that we need, occupational therapists, speech therapy, things that to providing services to students, right? There was lots of things that schools need to do were being outsourced. like you don't outsource like curriculum and instruction, things like that. Those are pillars, right? You've got to know how to teach, and you got to know what you're going to teach your kids. And if you don't have those things in place, you're never going to be a good school, and you need to do those things yourself. The research is very clear. Like, that's something schools have to learn and have to do. And so making sure that we were putting all of our, like aligning our resources, that we were doing the right work, and that we were improving outcomes for kids and helping our teachers be better teachers. And I think like people can look, like I'm not going to articulate what it was, but you can look at our data and our trajectory, and you can see that it's working, right? And now we're getting to the point now where we believe, like we're again on aggregate, our schools are better than the city average in terms of the high stakes tests that people look at us on an annual basis, and that's from being way below a few years ago. So, and we're just a notch better, but it's from where we've come, it's significant, and so we need to continue that work. But we're beginning to have a story now that we can go say, hey, we're not the best city the best school in the city, but we're getting so much better, and we're moving towards being in those conversations. And so now we might become an attractive place to where we might be able to get a meeting with someone and have a conversation with a philanthropist.
You can take Catherine to lunch.
All of those things. Well, I mean, ironically enough, and I'm not going to pitch, but again, my schools, as they get better, the City Bridge Foundation, Catherine's Foundation, runs a competition called Breakthrough Schools. And we have 2 campuses right now that are in the current cycle, and we have other campuses that will probably look at future cycles. So but those are campuses that 3 years ago never would have been ready to apply for a breakthrough, like never would have been ready, or maybe wouldn't have been competitive. Maybe is the right way to put it, right? But now, like where they are now, they're going to be much more competitive and have at least a chance to be in that conversation. Where before, I don't know how many rounds or cuts there are, they probably wouldn't have made it past the first round, right? It was just like, you're not ready.
Thank you so much for trying.
Thank you. Yeah, you're not ready. So
sort of like a Walton startup grant.
Absolutely.
So great. You might need to start learning about curriculum and talent.
Yeah, it'd be helpful if you're going to run a school. If you knew about instruction, you knew about curriculum.
Okay, so I'm cheering for you in the Breakthrough Schools competition.
Okay, so we're near the time for folks to ask questions, but obviously DC charters are 20 years old. Charter schools in the U.S. is 25. Where do we go from here? How do we start getting Washington Leadership Academy was recently granted a charter here in the city. They're doing a lot in virtual. I know that City Bridge touted them. How do we bring more innovative, interesting, diverse type of school models into the district that might not yet be proven? And what is the role of philanthropy in that space?
Can I complicate your question? One of the things we mentioned in the book is a sort of a lively debate in which Scott is one partisan about whether DC should, in effect, settle for 2 parallel sectors, 44% of the kids in charter schools and 56% in DCPS, or whether DC should aspire to be New Orleans, where the chartering is the whole story, the whole game. Scott, if I remember correctly, is very much on the side of keeping a 2-sector arrangement.
I am too.
And he offered some reasons in the piece he wrote, explaining that. So a big picture question is whether DC should be eaten up by charters, as New Orleans was, or they're on one side of the table and another large sector is on the other side.
It's a great debate. I should say that we just released the latest enrollment numbers, and DCPS, one of the really exciting things in DC is that beginning about 7 or 8 years ago, a 50-year decline in the enrollment in schools, public schools and charter schools, was turned around, and we're now adding students. We've been adding about 2,000 students a year
to the combined sector.
To the combined sector. Been adding about 2,000 students a year for 6 or 7 years, and now it looks like that's accelerating. So this year we added close to 4,000 new students.
That's a big deal.
So it's very healthy for the city, and it's not only because charter schools are growing, but DC public schools began growing again as well. So DCPS had been losing students forever since the early 60s when they enrolled 150,000 students, and they declined to a little more than 50,000, and now they've been 55,000. Now they've been growing, and they're close to 90,000 students. This year, we grew faster than they did, and our market share ticked up. We were at 44.5%, and I think now we're at 46%.
You are.
So
That's
if
great.
that continues in
I have
30
old memories.
years, we'll be where New Orleans is.
Just since yesterday.
Oh,
But you don't aspire to that.
My belief is that having a successful, healthy neighborhood system of schools of right actually affords people more choice than an all-choice system, because they have the comfort of knowing that they can go to their neighborhood school. And for many people, they like the community, the neighborhood community that a neighborhood school of right creates. Now, one of the things that is a characteristic of our best charter schools is they create community as well. They're not community around place, they're community around shared values and shared ideas. My own view is that both of those offer families more choice than only one type.
And I'm pretty strongly in that same camp. I think the city is best if we have a thriving traditional public school sector and a thriving charter school sector, and they're different. You can't actually compare them exactly. They have different types of schools, and they should have different types of schools if we're going to be a very healthy city. I also think that the fact that DCPS has turned around its enrollment, and it grew only a tiny bit last year, but it's been growing now for the last decade. That's spectacular. The whole city is growing so much that we're soon going to need more schools, which is kind of where I take it back to the question you asked. So what's next? We're going to run through excess inventory and the growth patterns that are set out for schools in another couple years if we keep growing between 2,000 and 4,000 kids per year in the city. And we're going to need that next set of schools. And we can't get that growth just by asking places like KIPP and DC Prep to grow. DCPS can grow and add schools. They just added one new school under the Empowering Males of Color initiative this year. But the growth is going to have to come from both sectors, and it's going to be healthiest if we're looking to create new models that are even better than what we have now.
I love it. I think at this, do you want to add anything?
No, I would concur and just say, we want better schools for all kids, period. So.
Sounds great. I think we'll go to questions. Bill Evers, you were about to jump out of your seat.
He's always about to jump out of his seat. I've known him for a long time.
So I'm Bill Evers from Hoover Institution. I wondered if you could comment to maybe you have people that are listening from afar, and maybe some people are not super familiar with this, but how much charter school effect is there on the public schools? In other words, is there emulation? Is there competitive pressure? Do the public schools lose some money when a child moves from the public school to the charter sector, from the regular public school to the public charter sector? And so they're feeling a little pain and a little pressure to improve in whatever way they choose to be more attractive to the parents.
Sure. So in DC, it is almost completely money following the child. So if a child moves from a DCPS school to a charter school, that full amount of money gets transferred. So there is definitely that competitive dynamic. I think there's a difference of opinion sometimes about whether the competition from charter schools was a reason for the improvement in DCPS. My own view is it certainly created competitive pressure, not to take anything away from the extraordinary work of Michelle Rhee and Kaya Henderson and legions of people at DCPS who worked so hard to turn that school around. I think we helped create the conditions for that because the urgency was even greater. There's also a lot of learning. So people tend to focus on what can DCPS learn from charter schools, and we're seeing some of that. For example, I think 8 DCPS schools this year adopted extended day and extended year, which is something we see in a lot of our charter schools. But it goes both ways as well. There's a lot that DCPS is doing. For example, we still beat them on graduation rates, but they're catching up fast. And some of the things that they're doing, for example, around 9th grade academies, we're now seeing charter schools taking. So we're seeing the learning actually now going both ways.
I just want to piggyback on that. What's unique about charters is, at least I think in the original concept of charters, was that they would be the laboratories of learning, of being able to try new things. And there's been a criticism that many charters are not sharing their best practices and or public schools not extracting those best practices and applying them with their own. Do you feel like DC is sort of a unique place where that's happening a lot more versus maybe other markets?
I think.
I was just going to say, it does take two to tango, and charters can innovate till the cows come home, and if the district wants nothing to do with them or wants them to go away or is politically trying to shut them down or is simply brain dead, and too many districts are, then they're not going to get a lot of pickup from whatever the charters are doing in the district sector.
I mean, if you read the Post, Jay Matthews just did this whole thing where he's basically imploring the new chancellor, hey, look, what's happening here is working. Both sectors are needed, and just come in and play nice, and let everybody sort of learn from each other. To Scott's point, I think there's learning that happens both ways when everybody's sort of just playing nice in the sandbox, and that's the optimal sort of setup. So there are things they're doing people can learn from. There are things happening in some of the charter schools that they can learn from, for sure.
The gentleman right here in the second full row. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Philip Pennell. I'm the vice chair of the board of the Community College Preparatory Academy Public Charter School, which is a charter school for adults east of the Anacostia River. And I both live and work in Ward 8, which statistically is the poorest ward. My school really struggles because we're dealing with adults, and we were the first charter school for adults to be established east of the river, and many of our students are unemployed. They're homeless. We have to raise money for basic things, money for transportation, so that they can get to class. And we've been blessed in the sense that community support for my school is growing and is very well respected, but that's not the case with the other schools in the ward, particularly in Ward 8. Among the activists and the leaders, their attitudes towards charter schools is suspicion at best and outward hostility at worst. And recently the NAACP passed a resolution calling for a moratorium on charter schools.
That was the national NAACP.
The national,
yeah.
Right, the national NAACP. And that sentiment is microcosmically reflected in my ward. What is your response to that?
I mean, I would just offer that we run a school in Congress Heights up in Ward 8, and if any Ward 8 leaders that want to come see a really good school in action, are welcome to visit that school. If they want to see a charter school that works for Ward 8 families, works for Ward 8 students, at any particular time. I know the principal would be happy to have people in to visit to see that school. I mean, I cannot speak for some of the other schools in Ward 8. There are other good schools in Ward 8, other good charter schools, but ours is happy to open its door to help some of those folks see what a good charter school does for the kids and families that it serves, because she's running one of the better Ward 8 charter schools over there and has been for a number of years now. And I think is running one of the better schools in Ward 8 in general, DCPS or charter. So I'm happy to have people come see that and maybe get a better understanding of what it means, because when you walk through the doors, it looks like a school. It just happens to be funded independently. That's all.
And my impression of Ward 8 is that I have not encountered that kind of hostility. I can think of other wards in the city where I actually encounter more anti-charter sentiment than in Ward 8. And I think part of that is attributable to the late Marion Barry, who was mayor of this city, but also after he was mayor was an elected council member from Ward 8, and initially was a charter skeptic, and then became persuaded because of the experience of visiting some outstanding charter schools in Ward 8, became a passionate supporter of charter schools. And so many people in Ward 8 took their lead and took their cue from Marion Barry that his support for charter schools, I think, has even though he's gone, has left a residue of goodwill toward charter schools that might not have been there.
Hi. Thank you guys for opening this discussion today. My name is Sherelle Swain. I'm from Focus. And my question is, from your lens, what areas would you all think would be most beneficial for charter schools to receive support for existing charter schools and individuals or groups interested in maybe beginning a charter here in DC?
What areas? Do you
Yeah,
mean-
what issues or areas of support do you think would help to strengthen the current charter school community here?
So I've got one, and I think Scott shares my view on this. I have called DC Talent Mecca for years because I think that educators and school leaders from all over this country want to be here. Our conditions are so good, and this is just a city people really want to live in. We probably had perfect conditions 4 or 5 years ago. All the major teacher pipelines were kind of going at full capacity. Race to the Top funding was available for them. We had just launched a couple residency programs here. DCPS had just announced much higher salaries for teachers. Feels like that movement has crested, and it's crested at a moment when the city's growing so fast that the need for great teachers and leaders is greater now than it was 5 years ago. So I am hearing it, and I hear Russ nodding too. I hear it anecdotally from schools. I think Scott's hearing it all the time. I think we need to recapture that market position, making this talent mecca for the country, and being able to actually invest in residencies and teacher pipelines and things like the Georgetown EML program, which is now going to be cross-sector, as Russ said. That feels like the obvious place that's not getting enough support right now and that needs it.
And I would 100%, and I've talked with a few of the school leaders, so I knew coming in if I said this, I wasn't on an island. Like that's probably the biggest gap, like in terms of, and the fact that it is cresting or on a little bit of a downward slope, we need to reverse that. This is a people-driven business, and so like these schools are staffed with people. You have to have good teachers and good leaders, and we have to have more of an emphasis on that. And again, anecdotally, talking to someone that controlled multiple funds at one point about putting some people into a residency program, and they wanted to help support 2. And I was like, great. And I asked the question, I'm happy to take 2. I run 6 schools, and like it would be in an optimal world, I'm sending all 6. And they go, the response was, I know, but our human capital fund is our smallest fund. And my response to that, well, that's just, and forgive me, that's just stupid, right? Like in terms of the human capital probably should be the biggest fund, and the other things should maybe be a little bit smaller than that, given the importance of humans in education in schools. So, but yeah, that I would totally and completely agree with that. So,
This gentleman right here.
I just want to add that you're blessed in DC if you've got the native talent waiting to be developed for this sector, which is what I hear you all talking about. Not that you have to bring in people from other places because you don't have the human capital here, but that needs to be nurtured, cultivated, developed, shaped. If you were trying to open a charter school in Springfield, Ohio, you would be saying, who on earth can we hire?
Right. This is a relative problem. Yeah, I understand
Well,
that.
I mean, but there are charter models in areas where there might not be a lot of talent, but they've developed a culture and professional development within their organization that they're able to help train and prepare those folks.
If they're big enough to have got that, yes, you're absolutely right. They're working
Like I
on
think
that.
of idea.
They're working on that in Kansas City, but again, they've got the help of the Kauffman Foundation to do that, to try to turn Kansas City into a talent magnet. New Orleans pulled that off. Before the hurricane, nobody thought of New Orleans as a talent magnet.
Memphis is doing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Teacher town.
Thank you for the dialogue. My name is Eric Goldsam with One World Education, and first a comment leading to a question for Russ. And you mentioned Raj Vinakona, and because of his vision, 15 years ago I went and taught at Seed, and then I was recruited by a principal over to DC Prep, and from my experiences at those 2 schools, another charter school teacher and I started the nonprofit One World Education. For the last decade, we've been working with more than 30 public and charter schools on improving instruction and learning. And after that, from those experiences, we're now planning on opening our first charter school. Leading to my question for Russ, of how much time do you dedicate to fundraising every day, every week, annually? Thank you.
I mean, it's when you're in startup mode, I feel like it's a different, that's a different commitment, right? Because I feel like when you're in startup mode, you like accessing the Title V and some of the other funds that's available to you, whatever startup money you can get, if you can tap into that through the state superintendent's office, and once you have gotten conditional approval, get into the Walton pipeline, you can kind of balance how much time you're spending on fundraising and things. In terms of my current situation, where I'm in a much more mature organization, we're just starting, as an organization and as a board, to think about development and fundraising. And I think at this point, it's probably maybe at this point 10-15% of my time, like each week, because we're setting up a series of events. We're starting to do more and more about that. And I'm fortunate in that, to one of the things Scott mentioned earlier, our organization has been very lucky in terms of like the SOAR grants for like the last few years have been competitive grants that all schools compete for. And so we have, very fortunately, we have a very talented individual, Robin Chait, who has like helped us frame a lot of our requests to ASIA under the SOAR program. And we've, over the last 4 years, I think we've received 4 or 5 like consecutive SOAR grants, which allow us to do a lot of additional interesting things in our school that otherwise aren't funded. So that simplifies my job of fundraising, right? When we're very successful in terms of tapping into those federal dollars, as Scott mentioned. And it puts a little bit less pressure on the board in terms of the fundraising things or the things we want to do, because we get those ancillary funds from programs like that. So, but my role is continuing to evolve, because we've gone from turnaround and fixing the school into like kind of a different trajectory at this point. And so we're realigning all that and going through a planning process and getting ready to be more thoughtful about some of those things. So that's really a good question for me in about like 6 months. But yeah, it varies. It varies.
A point. The SOAR Act is legislation that was passed by the U.S. Congress. It's authorized hopefully every 5 or so years, and it provides 3-sector funding to support school improvement, both opportunity scholarships for kids to go to private schools, additional funds for the D.C. public charter schools, and then also funds equal amount for D.C. public, traditional public schools. So, just
And
a
if
little
you hadn't noticed,
footnote.
part of Catherine's previous life was on the Hill.
And she was the godmother of the SOAR Act, so we have her to thank for that.
I christened that program.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I would just say, I used to be the board chair of a charter school in California where we had per pupil money of half of what DC was. And we thought, okay, we're going to put a huge amount of effort into raising another $2,000 or $3,000 per pupil, which was a lot. And that was a big focus of ours. Now we're in DC, and schools are getting that extra $2,000 or $3,000 plus an extra $2,000 or $3,000. And so from this perspective of coming from California, schools should have enough. And it's not to say that fundraising can't help with things you want to do, whether it's field trips or international trips or expansion or things like that. But I always worry, frankly, when I meet with a school and meet with their board and hear them say, oh, if only we could fundraise this extra money, we could make our school good. That's a warning sign to me that they're focusing on the wrong things. Mm-hmm. They should be focusing, as Russ said, on how they use effectively the money they have. There's a lot more leverage to that, in my opinion, here in DC.
And you would be hearing something very different if you were in California or Arizona or a number of other places where charter funding is pretty meager.
Yeah, agreed.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quentin Liggins, and I'm with Leading Educators. You stole a little bit of my thunder because I was going to ask about teacher professional development. We have the great fortune of working in Teacher Town in Memphis. We also work in Kansas City with the Kauffman Foundation. So from each...
But not in Springfield, Ohio.
Not in Springfield, Ohio.
Okay.
But they have just combined their high schools there, the 2 traditional public high schools, and they have a great football coach, and they're doing well. So,
Okay.
yes.
He did his homework.
How do you know about
Ohio?
I played football at Holy Cross, and one of my good friends and teammates played at Springfield South. Well, now it's combined, and John Legends from Springfield.
You know more than I do. I quit.
A bunch of I do my homework.
Pick another small city.
Pick another example.
I think that's a mic drop. You have to go.
I try. My question to each one of you is, from your individual seats, how do you see the charter sector in DC working to support the development of their teachers and instructional leaders to be able to provide a high quality sector and education for students?
I think, from our perspective, we're looking at again, it comes back to how we build instructional capacity and instructional quality in our schools, both within our leaders and within our teachers. Our best instructional eyes are on our curriculum and instruction team. Under the leadership of someone I know that you know, Siobhan Gibson, who's one of the sharpest instructional eyes in the city. And so, utilizing the talent that we have and putting them all in coaching roles and support roles allows us to build and improve. And that's the focus of a lot of, we have a quote unquote central office, but on any day when you come in there, they're all at schools. because like people working on a curriculum and instruction and improving the implementation or improving teaching and learning don't sit in a building away from kids, right? They're out in schools working side by side. You're co-teaching, you're co-planning, you're observing, you're giving coaching and feedback. And we're not really in so much of an evaluative space. We're in a coaching and development space in terms of how we approach this. I mean, we have teacher evaluations, but a lot of what we're doing leading up to that is really coaching our staff and trying to build their instructional capacity. We want folks that want to get better. And I think we look at the ecosystem and the third parties and what makes sense as it relates to what complements that. But we are, at Center City, we've said from day one in terms of, since I got there, we're big believers in focusing on what we teach, how we teach, and that we're only going to get better by doing it ourselves. And so we're focused on building the capacity in our organization, and we really limit the amount of third party touches that we have to things like graduate school programs, to intensive 2-week things that Relay does, to things that will complement or build the skill set of our principals in addition to the work that we're doing with them to kind of get them where we want them to be in terms of being instructional leaders or being good teachers in our schools.
So just to add to that, Russ has mentioned a couple organizations, Relay and the Georgetown EML program. I think it's really hard for each school to do this 100% themselves. It makes sense that these other organizations that Russ is referring to. I just finished 9 years as the TFA local board chair, and they have communities of practice intentionally around trying to make teachers in the TFA program, alumni of TFA and core members, much, much better teachers. They're working with you guys, creating a whole community of practice around specifically getting better instructionally. So I think that the best organizations own the responsibility themselves, the way Russ is talking about, and also really leverage the best nonprofits out there in the city. And then there are philanthropists that are working to bring more great training organizations here to DC, which is all to the good.
And that is a point about philanthropy, that if you want to support charter schools, it's not enough just to support the schools. You need to support the support structure around them, because many great charter schools are frankly subscale, and they rely on really strong nonprofits to provide all sorts of supports like teacher training.
Do you know anybody in Springfield, Illinois? Stop.
I think there's a question right over here in the back.
Hi, my name is Chris Murray from Thompson Coburn. My question is more national than DC. So I think one area, I think we're winning the education reform war on the ground, but I sense at the national level we're losing the PR war. And it would make sense to me that philanthropists would get more involved on the PR side, C4s, super PACs, doing ads on TV to counter, hit jobs by the New York Times and John Oliver, so that the national story is being told in a different way, that this could be a very effective use of philanthropic dollars. What do you think about that? Are we too focused on the granular, on this, the great student outcomes that are happening around the country, and not enough on the, the national message?
I think that's for you, Checker.
Really good question, and a very important one, and we touch on bits of it in the book. And it's a matter of intense interest and activity right now at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and at several other national organizations and with several national funders who have this exact question on their minds right now. And the move of a number of very wealthy individuals from just C3 work into C4 work and PACs and so on is probably necessary, whether you want to see more money going into election campaigns or not. You sort of sometimes have to fight fire with fire, and we may be stuck in that era. I also want to say two things. One is the charters and issues about charters have been largely neglected in the current election nationally, other than a sort of minor dust-up when Hillary Clinton sort of changed her position on charters that she had historically held. But there's been very little attention to this stuff, national election. Of course, we've been distracted by innumerable other things in the national election. The ground war is not being won everywhere. Let's be clear on that, too. The referendum that will be voted on in a couple weeks in Massachusetts to loosen the cap in Massachusetts is very likely going to fail. It's going to fail because the teachers' union and what I'm going to call the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party have gotten very smart about how to persuade upper middle class liberals in Newton and Brookline and Wellesley that having more charter schools in the state would be a bad thing. Astonishing from where I sit. So the battles are still very much underway in a lot of places. In addition to the national point that you made, which is a valid one and is getting attention, is all I can say about it.
And I guess the only thing I would add to that is that I think charter schools have benefited enormously from being a bipartisan issue. The charter school program in the Federal Department of Education started under President Clinton, and it has continued under Presidents Republican and Democratic. And my fear is that we are at risk of losing moderate Democrats, and that charter schools becomes a right-left kind of issue. I'm sure there's work that needs to be done on messaging and things like that, but I also think we need to up our game in terms of performance and in terms of oversight, so that the kinds of, frankly, often legitimate issues that are thrown at charter schools aren't there for people to sway the opinion of people who are kind of on the fence.
I'm just going to add, though, that arguably the best state-level charter school track record in the country is in Massachusetts, where
Okay.
the cap is
Fair
probably...
enough.
Okay.
All right, so one more question.
Anna Bryson, coming from California, and I'm very appreciative of all your comments. I'm going to take back information. But I do have a question. When you succeed, and when I was trustee of Capistrano Unified for 8 years, which is half of Orange County, we've chartered and approved a charter school that went on to become Oxford Prep, the #1 in the state. The problem is, with its 600 students, the state did not want it to be seen as #1. So they put 2 schools on top of it with 30 students in one school, 45 students in the other school, and claimed that that was equal to the performance of the 98% of 600 students. Okay, so I need to know, where do we fight and how do we fight to get them to tell the truth about the way they score?
Well, you have a very strong charter school association in California, and I guess I'd say that's where I would start.
I don't have anything to add. You've got a touchy, complicated statewide political situation in California also with respect to charters, and the Charter School Association has got its hands full on a bunch of fronts. And you also, however, on the upside, have a fifth of all the charter schools in the country are in California, and the charter population of Los Angeles, if it were a freestanding district, would be something like the 15th largest school district in America. So there's a lot to be said for California charters right now, even in the face of the kind of pushback that you just characterized.
Yeah. And sounds like you have a big school, 600 kids. That means you have 600 to 1,000 parents who obviously are proud of that school, and that's political capital that you might be able to use and turn that voice into stories and into a political asset. And I think that protects you then from getting unfairly targeted.
I am really grateful that all of you guys are here. Many, many thanks to the Fordham Institute and the Hoover Institute, specifically Hoover, for hosting us today. If anybody has any additional particular questions, those that are able to stay would be happy to answer your questions. Otherwise, I believe there's food and drinks and other snacks outside. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to Hoover.
Thank you, panel.
Thank you.